Hi, everyone. I'm Jenna Roll, Director of Education at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History and Sea Center. Welcome to Science Pub from Home. Thank you for joining us this evening, now with sunlight. We look forward to seeing you in April for our next Science Pub from Home, Phytoplankton, Indicators of Change in the Santa Barbara Channel, with a dear friend of mine and researcher and Quasars to Sea Stars alum, Sarah Marie Amiri. And you'll have a special guest host, another Quasars alum, and now the team programs manager at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History, Charlie Thrift. Some great news. The Sea Center, located on Stearns Wharf, has reopened with a freshly remodeled second floor exhibit, Dive In, Our Changing Channel, where the whole family can learn about the channel's unique habitats from rocky reefs to kelp forests and see the animals that live there. We're all so excited to welcome you all back. For more information, I'm going to put a link in the chat once I'm wrapped up talking here. But back to some more terrestrial present. Frédérique's book, Garden Allies, the insects, birds, and other animals that keep our garden beautiful and thriving, that will be the focus of tonight's presentation, is available for purchase in our very own museum store. And on all orders through March 19th, you, my dearly dedicated science pubbers, get 15% off all orders using the code SciencePub15, which I will also put in the chat. The museum store is also where you can find this gorgeous Claudia Pearson California wildflower bandana. I was feeling really extra inspired by all of the poppies that were flowering around Santa Barbara County this weekend. So as always, please continue to support your favorite local business like the museum store and Dargan's Irish Pub. So tonight, I am excited to introduce former Director of Education at the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden, Frédérique Lavoipierre. During her time with Botanic Garden, Frédérique shared her enthusiasm for native plants and insects with learners of all ages. Prior to working at the garden, she was the founding director of the Sustainable Landscape Professional Certificate Program at Sonoma State University, where she also revived the garden classroom program and established an entomology outreach program. Frédérique holds a Master's of Science in Biology with an emphasis on ecological principles of sustainable landscapes. Her research focused on plant and insect interactions. Prior to her graduate work, she founded and operated an organic nursery specializing in heirloom vegetables and culinary herbs from around the world. She currently lectures, teaches, and works as a consultant. She serves on the editorial advisory group for the American Public Gardens Association magazine, Public Gardens, and is on the content committee for the Pacific Horticultural Society. Frédérique authored a 10-year-long series, Garden Allies, for the Pacific Horticultural magazine and continues her contributions to the society. I don't know when you sleep, Frédérique, but thank you so much for joining us on this very perfect evening. When you're ready, please take it away.
Okay, let's go then. So first of all, thank you so much for hosting me tonight. And thank you for that lovely introduction. I appreciate it. Before we really get started, I just want to mention that the book, if you have seen it, has over 150 gorgeous pen and ink drawings done by Craig Lacker, who is a landscape architect and artist. And I've had the privilege of working with him for over 15 years now. It's delightful. This particular drawing you won't see in the book because it is for the next book, which is about how to create good habitat. These are native longhorn bees on sunflowers. And I also want to mention on the photo credits, if it doesn't have a credit, it's a photograph I took. And I'm not going to use a lot of scientific names in this presentation, although I have them if you'd like them. So as we get started, I'm going to tell you that we are going to delve into some science, but first of all, I'm going to show you a few more of these delightful drawings. I know when most of us think about garden allies, we're thinking about pollinators. And of course, pollinators are garden allies. Other garden allies, though, include decomposers, nutrient facilitators. There's all kinds of predators, parasites, and specialized relationships. And we're going to explore a lot of those. We are not going to look as closely at pollinators. And the first thing I'm going to do is show you some of these beautiful drawings I mentioned, but I am also going to be delving into some science, and then we will get back to pretty pictures and meet some of the different organisms we might see in our garden. So I will also mention to you that I have an unintended audience of people, and that is children who want to color in the drawings in the book. So I think our next effort is going to be a coloring book. So we are going to be looking a little bit at life beneath our feet. And if you want to know what these different organisms are, you might have to take a look at the book, because I'm going to save a little time here. And we will be these are the different categories in the book that we are going to be looking at as we go through our program this evening. And then we are going to look at flower visitors. We're going to dig a little deeper into parasitoids and predators and the differences. We're going to meet the beetles. And then garden commons is a little bit like that drawer in the kitchen. You don't know what to do with some things, and so you put them in that drawer. That's garden commons. The ground crew and beyond includes all kinds of interesting organisms. High and low is the vertebrates. So now let's get on to the science. Probably a lot of you are familiar with integrated pest management. This is a chart I adapted from UC Davis IPM program. And it is really, IPM is a decision support system for us to select pest control tactics. And the key for me is that it's based on a cost-benefit analysis, because it is being used by farmers and people with commercial greenhouses and, say, public gardens oftentimes. And for them, costs are very important. As gardeners, we have a little bit more of an aesthetic threshold as we move from one strategy on the left towards, eventually you can actually use conventional pesticides in this system. But today we're going to focus on biological control. And there are three kinds, and I will briefly describe these to you. The classical biological control, you're releasing insects and hoping for permanent control. The augmentative biological control, you are releasing insects for temporary control. And in conservation biological control, which will be our main topic of discussion this evening, you're attracting and establishing populations of insects that are already in your environment. So here's a little more detail about classical biological control, where we're introducing the natural enemy of an introduced pest. This here is Charles Valentine Raleigh, who's the chief of the Division of Entomology at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And at the turn of the previous century, around the 1900s, the citrus industry in California was hugely threatened by this insect in the bottom photograph here. And that is the cottony cushion scale. Charles Valentine Raleigh said, where did that thing come from? Well, it came from Australia, and he wanted to go and see if it had some natural enemies, asked his boss for permission, and the boss said, absolutely not. So he sent a staff member to a symposium in Australia with a secret mission to look for any insects that were preying on these cottony cushion scales. And his staff member came back with this Vidalia beetle, which you may guess is related to lady beetles from its appearance. And he also had a parasitic fly, and they established really well, and they saved the citrus industry. And that was wonderful. He is the father of biological control in America. But then they later found out, really, this is only effective under specific conditions, like perennial systems, orchards, orange orchards, for instance. And it can be very expensive now because you have to purchase insects. And the reason they're expensive is that besides raising them, there is a risk that they can switch hosts. And so they are extensively tested before they are released into the wild. Now we have augmentative biological control. So when you buy ladybugs, this is what you're doing. You're supplementing, you're introducing these natural enemies, and they might be native or non-native, and they can also be expensive. And there's these two strategies here, one where you're expecting control by the offspring, and the other where you're expecting an immediate reduction. And this is the ladybugs, and you're really using them as a biopesticide. And it is not ideal to be actually purchasing these migratory insects. They go back and forth from the Central Valley and the coast and the Sierra, and it is where they belong. And they don't even work very effectively. If you do purchase them, you can attract what you need, though. And this is where conservation biological control comes in. We're preserving and enhancing our existing natural enemies. And a few of those are introduced, especially when it comes to parasitic wasps, which are now, some of these are ubiquitous, and they are helpful, and they prey on aphids, for instance. And this is the only approach that creates a positive feedback loop. And that is because as you reduce pesticide and provide resources, the populations of natural enemies are going to build up. And as those populations build up, you don't really need pesticides. And so you are creating this wonderful loop, and eventually your garden will largely take care of itself if you have planned and planted it for this kind of control. So we're really talking about, managing your garden and managing the insects that are there. And I just want to mention always that there are so many ecosystem benefits to this type of pest management, as you can see here. And the result is, of course, that we are looking for long-term sustainability of our landscapes and the societal benefits that can come from reducing pesticides and welcoming life into the garden. So why native plants? Well, of course, I loved native plants for a long time. And when I started to work at the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden, I became much more immersed in why they are so important. And I became a real fan of natives there. And so let's talk about why you should all be fans of native plants. Natives, generally speaking, are supporting ecosystem health. And what is a native? Well, it's been there a long time, since before Europeans arrived. It evolved with the insects and birds and other animals that exist. But before you decide, I'm turning this off because I have other plants, I am not a purist. So if you have some other things in your garden, that's fine. If hydrangeas, for example, remind you of your grandmother, as they do me, of my grandmother, and they're not really providing habitat, they're not native to California, have a hydrangea, it's fine. Usually what is recommended is that you try for about half native plants. So I'm a pragmatist. Gardeners like to garden. So let's talk a minute about this relationship, coevolution. And Paul Ehrlich was an entomologist. Peter Raven was a botanist, and they popularized the term coevolution. Really, before their paper, Butterflies and Plants, most people had not heard the term coevolution. And of course, their paper really should have been titled Caterpillars and Plants, because that's what it was about, this close relationship that they had of speciation between butterfly species and their associated plant species. And they actually wrote this paper at a coffee table. So this leads to an evolutionary arms race, is what we call it, where, and we're going to use the monarch caterpillar as an example because we're also familiar with it, that as monarch caterpillars eat milkweed, the milkweed has to evolve to be more toxic. And as it evolves to be more toxic, the insect evolves to overcome that toxicity. And so this leads to speciation, and it leads to specialization. And lots of herbivorous insects, of course, are linked with certain plants, the ones they evolved with, the native plants, sometimes congeners, which evolved elsewhere but are very similar. So as we move along, we're going to talk about herbivorous insects, but it's good to keep in mind that a lot of the predators and parasitoids we're talking about today are also kind of closely linked to their prey. And so the bottom line is that native plants in general are superior for supporting biodiversity. They are supporting the insects that feed on the plants, and they're also supporting all the other organisms that rely on them. This is a pipevine swallowtail here with the caterpillars that are advertising how bad they would taste if you were a bird. And one of the key things here is that 90% of all herbivorous insect species are, to some degree or another, specialists. You probably have noticed by now I don't actually read all my slides to you, but I can certainly make a PDF available if people would like that at the end of the program. 90% of all herbivorous insect species are specialists. So their role in the food web is really important in our gardens. Our gardens are important. And if you don't like insects, you probably do like birds. 96% of birds are feeding their young arthropods, so insects and spiders and related species. And 70% of them will continue to eat these as adults. So despite the fact that we're always putting seed out for birds, they would really love us to give them some bugs. And they provide a lot of pest control in the garden. As an important part of our food web. Okay. So you can see that everything is connected, right? We tug at a thread and ping, it's going to reverberate all the way through the web. So we know that for healthy gardens, we really want to promote biodiversity. We rarely talk about what does that word really mean, biodiversity. I really liked this. This is a bumper sticker here, nature in your neighborhood, which is, I hope, what everybody's going to want to go home and do. So what is biodiversity? Let's take a minute. Here's some baby blue eyes and some tidy tips here. Usually when we're talking about biodiversity, people are really thinking about species richness, the number of species that are present in that environment, right? Oh, I have 1,000 species in my garden, or however many you happen to have, 80. But another really important thing is what is the abundance of each of these organisms? And it's really far more important than richness alone. If you just have one individual of 1,000 species, you really do not have good biodiversity. That brings us to functional biodiversity. And this is a photograph of a ladybug pupa, in case you've never seen one. So it isn't just the richness and the abundance of these insects, and in fact, plants as well, anything in the garden, but it's the identity of the species in the system and what role they're playing ecologically. So this way we can promote insurance species. And that means, say that we want things to attack aphids. Well, a lot of different things will eat aphids. Actually, hummingbirds like to feed them to their babies. But there's all kinds of different species of lady beetles that feed on aphids. There's lacewing insects that feed on them. There's parasitic wasps. There's all kinds of things. And so that provides us with this high functional group biodiversity, where, say, this particular lady beetle species here gets knocked out of the system by a pathogen. There are other things that can take its place. That creates a resilient ecosystem that can reorganize following a disturbance. And of course, when we're gardening, we're always disturbing everything. So is that it for the science? No, not quite. We have these factors that are going to promote biodiversity in our habitats. And when you look at this list of items, you can see why it is more difficult to implement conservation biological control in an agricultural system or a commercial greenhouse, say, although it can be done. But all of these things are features of gardens and can be implemented with good design. Okay. So we're going to talk for a minute about how insects feed on plants. These insects are all pollinating, and we don't usually think of them as plant feeders, but in fact, that is what they're doing. They're feeding on nectar, they're feeding on pollen, and I just want us to keep that in mind as we go along. This is usually what we're thinking about, right? Insects are feeding on plants. They're mining, chewing, they're boring, they're sap sucking. Some of them are feeding on roots, shoots, flowers, cambium, seeds. Well, we're usually thinking about this picture on the left. You will see that this caterpillar is actually pretty good at hiding. And it took me quite a while to find these Caterpillars, by the way, tend to feed at night when their predators can't find them. And during the day, they're often hiding cleverly. These caterpillars hide along the midrib underneath the leaf. Some caterpillars look like bird poops. There's all kinds of different ways of hiding. These over here are some Clarkia flowers. There is a tiny little bee on there. And these ovals, these kind of ragged little ovals that have been cut out, were made by a megachilid bee. So we have to look at this little leaf cutter bee here and think, well, is it beneficial? Is it a pest? It's making holes in the plant, but it's pollinating it. Nature is not a simple thing. So we can look here. So this on the right-hand side here is a little packet that was made by a moth. This is on bay laurel, and I find these in the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. Actually, I don't think most people notice them. They're kind of cool and very geometric. And on the left over there, on the far left, is a larva of a syrphid fly. And people will kill these and think that they're pests. They look like a little slug or something, right? But they're not. They're actually one of our best beneficial insects in the garden. And then here in the middle, we have the spider catching the fly. Well, maybe the fly was a pollinator, or maybe it's a predator of some kind, and now the spider's eating it, and maybe a bird's going to come along. So I really like to take a food web approach in general, and I am not always successful at this, but I try not to think in terms of pest or beneficial, which is often kind of a human construct, right? I try and think in ecological roles: pest, predator, decomposer, but sometimes I just want to say we do need to intervene, and there are some non-native injurious insects that have very few natural enemies. And so, yes, maybe then we do pull out a spray, and there are things like safer soaps. There's some interventions we can use that are not as ecologically damaging as others. The other thing to know is that some of our native insects have become problematic due to climate change effects. So things are changing. Oops, excuse me. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the science. And I'm going to now kind of loosely follow the format of the book and talk just a little bit about life between our feet. And so this is my only reading that I'm going to do for you today, and it is about the soil. And that's how I start the book. It's right here. The air into which plants extend their stems, leaves, flowers, and fruit is a virtual desert compared to the soil in which their roots seek anchorage, water, and nourishment. This is why the health and sustainability of any landscape begins with stewardship of its most valuable resource, the soil underfoot. Soil is not simply a canvas on which we paint our beautiful plant picture, but a living substrate. A good gardener, before anything else, tends the soil, the foundation of the landscape. We think that we are growing plants, but really we are growing soil. When we proudly show off our prized tomatoes, we could just as proudly show off a handful of the fertile soil from whence they came. Fertile soil includes a complement of humus, organic matter, that has decomposed until it has reached a stable state. We have many garden allies, seen and unseen, to thank for that. As Leonardo da Vinci remarked long ago, we know more about the movement of celestial bodies than about the soil underfoot. It is still true today. Just about every available surface under our feet is teeming with life. Incredibly, even the thin film of water that coats soil particles and lines pores in the soil harbors microscopic organisms that navigate those minute spaces. Fascinating stories emerge from the soil. And with that, we will move on. So there's a lot of unnoticed life in the soil. I love this drawing here. It's the only drawing in my program tonight that came from a different book, one that I really love, Life in the Soil, A Guide for Naturalists and Gardeners, by my friend James Nardi. It's a really delightful book. It has a great explanation of how soil is formed and a lot of wonderful illustrations as well. So there are a lot of microscopic things that are very common in your soil. One of them is this springtail on the left. And you might have seen these. Sometimes they reproduce in great numbers and they're hopping around everywhere. The pseudoscorpion is a little more shy. You may not have seen one before, and they are completely harmless and very, very tiny. Then we have earthworms, of course. So earthworms, you may know that our earthworms are not native. By the way, they are from Europe, but there they are in our gardens. So we welcome them there. And if you like to go fishing, don't leave your bait out in the woods. This is an earthworm egg on the right-hand side here. And a single earthworm can actually produce 10 pounds of castings a year. So that's 10 pounds of earthworm manure. They accelerate decomposition, and the tunnels they're making provide channels for the penetration of roots, water, air, and nutrients. And this is why I'm a big fan of no-till whenever possible. I very rarely till anything. It's been many years. You can build your soil by adding compost to the top, and the worms will mix it in for you. Can require a little bit of patience. And then we have decomposers and nutrient facilitators. Decomposers and nutrient facilitators are sometimes the same thing, right? Mushrooms come to mind. So mushrooms you may have heard of as mycorrhizal fungi too. And those help plants to absorb nutrients of various kinds and water. And without these organisms, really, crushed rock is just soil. Excuse me, soil is just crushed rock. Got that backwards, okay? And it is these organisms and bacteria and all kinds of different microbes that help soil become a living thing. And on the right-hand side here, these are the nodules that are being formed by nitrogen-fixing bacteria, or rather the plant is forming the nodules, and inside are the nitrogen-fixing bacteria. This is really common in legumes, and once these roots rot, then it releases the nitrogen that the plants need. But moving on the wing, flower visitors. I resisted putting in a chapter on pollinators because so many insects are visiting flowers and not necessarily good pollinators. Butterflies being a case in point, many of them are not actually very good pollinators because they perch way up above the flower and they're sipping nectar. That is a generality, of course. So bees, let's talk about bees. You may know we have 20,000 bee species in the world, and 4,000 of those are found in the United States, and 1,600 are found in California. We have a wonderful diversity of bees, especially in Southern California and in the desert areas. So they are the only insects that purposely carry pollen around. They go out and collect it and carry it back to their nests. And so they are our most important pollinators. They have branched hairs, which also helps them to grab onto pollen. They're the only insects I know of that do have branched hairs. And only a few years ago, we found out that they actually have an electrostatic charge. So they actually, like a pollen magnet. So about 70% of our native bees are solitary. About 70% are also ground nesters, and there's some overlap, not a lot. And they are mostly stingless, and only females sting. So enjoy your native bees, and they come in all different sizes and colors. Some of them are incredibly minute, and probably you don't even notice them. Everybody wants to know, what are those bees doing on the left? Those are male sunflower bees. And solitary bees don't really have any use for males in the nest, so they have to find other places to sleep at night, and that's what these bees are doing. And they would come back to the same spot, every single day. And my neighbors thought I was maybe a little crazy out there in my front yard with a camera taking photos of the boys every evening. And now we have moths and butterflies. So yeah, here's a butterfly perching above a flower. So some of the skippers actually are pretty decent at pollinating. And one interesting thing is that many moths are actually very good pollinators. So the Lepidoptera, which is moths and butterflies, are divided about 90% moths and 10% butterflies. The reason we notice butterflies so much is they tend to be bigger and colorful. They're out in the day when we are, and a lot of moths are very tiny little brown things, and they're out at night. And so we don't necessarily see the great diversity of moths that are in our gardens. And then flower visitors includes the hunting wasps. And that's because the hunting wasps are flower visitors, and they feed on nectar. And it is their larvae that feed on meat in the form of caterpillars, spiders, troop bugs, all kinds of things. And what they do is that they will stock their nests with these different things. And one of the ways to tell bees apart from wasps behaviorally is that bees are vegetarians, are feeding their babies pollen and nectar, whereas these wasps are feeding their babies meat. And we will meet some other wasps in a couple of moments here. So then we have flies. I'm a big fan of flies, and pretty much most of the flies that you see visiting flowers are some kind of benefit to you as a gardener. The syrphid fly, the hoverfly larva, we were looking at that little larva a little while ago. They're one of our best friends in the garden. And so most of them are wasp and bee mimics, and again, many, many different species. If you ever have a chance to see the collections at the Natural History Museum, it is eye-opening how many different species of these exist. And this is a tachinid fly on the left. So the tachinid fly is a parasite, and the hoverfly is a predator. The hoverfly adult only feeds on nectar and pollen, and it is the larvae that are preying. And the same thing with this tachinid fly on the left is also a nectar and pollen feeder, but its larvae are parasitic. Here is a fascinating fly. This is the native California orchid, Epipactis gigantea, the California stream orchid. And this photograph was taken by a friend of mine, sent it to me one day and said, "Hey, what kind of bee is this?" Well, now he knows better. He knows that he can look at these antennae and say, "Oh, that must be a fly." And it is, it's a hoverfly. And this is the pollinator for Epipactis. And orchids have all kinds of strange pollination mechanisms. And in this case, these are pollinia, and they're like little sacs that hold the pollen. And the fly comes in, and the orchid slaps these little packets down on top of the fly. And you can see that this fly has accumulated quite a number of packets. And when it goes into the next flower, a packet or two may come off. And this is how it achieves pollination. This is just one of many, many specialized relationships of our native plants to insects. And an exceptional photograph. So thank you, Phil. So let's dig a little deeper with predators and parasitoids. This right here is a robber fly, by the way. I have not been telling you what is in these pictures in the interest of saving a couple of minutes here. So it's a really ferocious predator. It kills and eats many individuals. And that is a key to what a predator is. Whereas a parasite is on or inside a host, and it's usually far smaller. It rarely kills its host because it's usually bound to a single host for life. And it may move from host to host as a larva or even have completely different hosts. Okay. But then you'll hear me talk about parasitoids. Parasitoid adults may be much larger than their host insect. The larvae live on or inside a host, but the adults have a free living stage, and it's a key difference. And the other key difference is that they kill their hosts, almost invariably. As with everything in nature, there are exceptions. And usually parasitoids are insects, and they're almost always flies or wasps. So we're going to just take a quick look at these two groups. Here's the flies. This is a tachinid fly again on the left, and they tend to be very bristly. If you see bristly flies visiting your flowers, welcome them. And the only ones that I see visiting flowers that I do not think of as beneficial are the blue bottle and green bottle flies that you will recognize. And this here on the right is a bee fly. It's a fly that's not a stinger. It's a very long proboscis, and it has a pretty furry body, and it does tend to collect some pollen, and they are pollinators, and they parasitize ground nesting bees and wasps. So again, here they are. They're an important pollinator for certain plants, but they're parasitizing bees and wasps that we might welcome. And so again, nature is complicated. I don't have any photographs of our very smallest allies. They are not in the flower visitor section because some of these do not rely on nectar and especially not pollen as adults. Some of them are so tiny, they probably look like dust motes to you when you're out in your garden. And there are different kinds that will parasitize eggs, larvae, or pupae. And clearly the egg parasites are the best because then that caterpillar's egg will never hatch. And the larval ones, actually a parasitized caterpillar can sometimes eat even more than a non-parasitized caterpillar, but it will not live to reach adulthood and reproduce. And clearly a pupal parasite, well, that insect, the caterpillar again, probably has done its damage already, but it will not be able to hatch out into adulthood. Some of these insects are extraordinarily small. I took my box when I was in grad school to the California Academy of Sciences and asked Dr. Zuparco to take a look at them. I was very proud of my collection of parasitic wasps. And he said, oh, let me show you some really tiny wasps. And he pulled out a microscope slide, and under the cover slip, there must have been 50 insects under there. Meet the beetles. So we have the lady beetles that I talked about before. The one on the left is on milkweed, and the one on the right, this is a mealybug destroyer. That's the adult up on top, and the larva on the bottom. I often see these over at Lotus Land. They have some show up every year on some palm trees. These are soldier beetles, and they look a lot like blister beetles, and it's one of the reasons I don't like that little card that's like good bugs on one side and bad bugs on the other. It's really easy to think that these might be blister beetles, and they're not. They are actually one of the best predators you can have in your garden, family Cantharidae. And the larvae are found in the soil, and they pupate in leaf litter. Another reason to be careful about not raking up all of your leaf litter. And they are predators as both adults and larvae, attacking aphids, caterpillars, grasshopper eggs, mites, little insects. Then we have predaceous ground beetles, and look at the mandibles on that guy. So one of the ways to tell the difference between the ground beetles and the darkling beetles, which they resemble, the darkling beetles are herbivorous, is simply behavior. The predaceous ground beetles are a hunting predator, and they run. They're really fast. They're chasing down prey. And the darkling beetles, sometimes people think of these as the beetles with their butt up in the air, or stink beetles, and but they move more slowly. And the carabid beetles are abundant in most gardens, but they're nocturnal, so you may not have noticed many. And they eat all kinds of things: caterpillars, beetle grubs, grasshoppers. Some of them prey on snails and slugs. And then we have leaf beetles, and I put them here so that we can see that sometimes the controls are insects that we want to have eating plants. And in this case, this Klamath weed beetle is eating St. John's wort, Hypericum perforatum, which is a toxic rangeland weed. They have been very effective in doing that. And we have also sometimes introduced some weevils for the same reason, to control weeds. And here we are on our garden commons, familiar garden insects. And this, by the way, is an ambush bug, one of my very favorite insects. Sometimes you'll see them hanging out on goldenrod. So the true bugs, there are plenty of them that are herbivorous. The one on the left is a predator. And it's good to remember about these, that they often serve as great food for others. And they are also very good at hiding themselves when they're herbivorous. And the predators are often in these bright aposematic colors that are warning things that not to mess with them. So what is a true bug? It has piercing, sucking mouth parts, and you can see it on both of these insects here. And it is one reason to not pick them up unless you know what they are. Some of them have really bad bites, others not. So good to know. And then we have this group here, true bugs, also the homopteran groups. And we used to think these were all related, and they are not all related, but these are a lot of our most problematic garden insects, and I still like to talk about them together. And that includes scale insects, whiteflies, aphids, mealybugs. This is the nymph of a plant hopper on the left. And on the right, you can see where these aphids that produce sugar are being guarded by an ant that likes to collect the sugar and is about to try and attack this ladybug to keep it away. So if you're having aphid problems, you can, or any of these homopterans, sometimes what you really need to do is to control the ants and then let the natural predators come in and do the work for you. This is a dragonfly, Lily. It has just emerged. That's why it's sitting there on my hand. They are an unrecognized hero in the garden. They will eat their weight in mosquitoes daily. The adult and larvae are both predatory. They're as much fun to watch as hummingbirds, as far as I'm concerned. And the dragonflies will fly a long way from water. So if you put a water feature in, you are probably going to see some dragonflies in your garden. Then we have the musicians, the Orthoptera. They are really important food for birds and other animals, and a lot of them are really good at disguising themselves. This grasshopper on the left, out in a desert shrub, we spent a long time staring at each other, but it is so well hidden. Also good to know, katydids, this is a nymph on the right, actually are omnivorous, so they are doing some good work out there for us. Then we have mantises. They are not related to grasshoppers, by the way. Native species are the best, and but they're generalist predators. And the Chinese mantises, which are the egg cases that you buy at nurseries and other stores, are not native. They compete with our native mantises and have even been known to get large enough to attack hummingbirds. So yeah, I usually don't advise that. But one insect that is good to buy is lacewings. If you don't already have a lot of lacewings in your garden, they are a delightful thing to introduce. They're nocturnal. You won't see them often. The adults feed on nectar, but the larvae are voracious predators of aphids and some other soft-bodied little insects. So the ground crew and beyond, I think I'm going to be going a couple minutes over. I hope this is going to be okay with you. These are non-insect invertebrates. And in my book, I also cover snails and slugs and galls and pathogens. But here, I just wanted to point out the difference between the centipedes on the right and the millipedes on the left. Millipedes, again, are herbivorous, and so they tend to move slowly. They're rounder. And the centipedes move very quickly. They're a hunting predator. Those are the ones that can sting, but just don't pick them up. Leave them there to do their good work. And let's go on. Spiders. Please don't be afraid of spiders. Spiders are wonderful. Most of them are very shy. They can rarely pierce human skin. We have very few spiders that are actually venomous. And look at this beauty on the right here. Oh, and even the one on the left, the green lynx spider. The one on the right is a crab spider. And although crab spiders like to hang out on flowers, and sure they catch pollinators sometimes, but they tend not to be extremely abundant. And then the vertebrates. There are a lot of vertebrates we don't want in our gardens, right? I don't want deer in my garden and I keep them out. This cute little bush tit's another thing though, and I would love to have it there. And oops, I'm gonna go back here a minute. And I'm going to tell you that vertebrates, of course, have very different habitat needs than do the insects we've been talking about. So water features, they need different kinds of shelter. They like some brush piles, rocks, logs, all to be covered in my next book. Amphibians. Amphibians are very sensitive to pesticides. We love frog and toads. Toads, I actually have not seen a toad in my garden for a good long time now, and they are so sensitive to pesticides. If this is the only reason that you stop using pesticides in your garden, it's a good one. Reptiles. If you're lucky enough to have things like garter snakes in your garden, be happy. King snakes, wonderful. If you have a rattlesnake and you know where it lives, you may be able to avoid it, or you can call a rescue to come and take it away and release it somewhere where it can be safe. And you may not be lucky enough to have pond turtles in your garden, but I wanted to include them anyway. Birds. So some birds do nibble plants. I've had my peas nibbled by birds more than once and had to replant, but mostly we welcome them, right, with bird baths and plants that provide food for them. It's really important if you plant berried plants with berries on them that you try and plant native plants, because birds that eat berries poop out in the woods, and that is one of the ways that plants invade other systems. So what can you do? Well, you can put up a bat house, and you could be observant. And I often recommend that people think about getting themselves a pair of close focusing butterfly binoculars. You can sit on your patio and watch not only butterflies and other insects, but they're great for watching hummingbirds and other birds. So just look at your plants. What is going on there? Those are California stick insects on the right there on a live oak. Visit gardens as much as you can and look and see what's going on there. I have become a big fan of taking pictures of signage so I can read it later and remind myself. This is a sign at the Arboretum at Davis. Be an example. This is the Melissa Garden. It was planted as a bee haven. And so this is the example. Then the woman who did this had field trips for years, bringing people out here to get educated about bees, both native and honeybees. Here is a garden that was also planted at Leaping Frog Winery to encourage life in the garden. Here is a swimming pool that was planted with habitat all the way around it. Flowers, and so your neighbors see these things, and here is a front courtyard, all native plants. Be a master gardener. Master gardener, I had no idea, one of the largest volunteer organizations in the country, and they do good work in many places and educate a lot of people. Join or volunteer at your local botanic garden, native plant society. School gardens desperately need you. I'm sure that the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History can find some wonderful work for you to do. Join iNaturalist, and if you've never used this app, it is so simple and so much fun. This woman, Bonnie Nickel, actually found this insect out of its normal range in San Diego, and her experience is not that unusual. If you need some help identifying things, bugguide.net is superb, and iNaturalist can be a lot of help as well. Also, if ever you have a chance to do a bio blitz locally, go for it. Turn off the lights. Nocturnal insects and animals are really struggling. Our country is really lit up at night. Darksky.org is a fantastic resource if you would like to know more about plant natives. Plant natives for the native bees, for all the other animals, for yourself. And then I just would like to say, so this, I live by this quote. This, of course, is the gorgeous meadow at the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. You can walk around and go look at all the insects there. Read my book, Garden Allies. I have a Facebook page that I'm on quite a bit. I'm on Instagram a little bit, and my website, gardenallies.com, is not quite ready to roll out. So it is in progress. Okay, and that's it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was so inspiring and like informative.
Oh, good. Well,
we have a few questions that came up. Hang on, everybody. I'm gonna like time warp us through some slides real quick. Just close your eyes if you get motion sickness. We had some questions about what some of these insects were. Let's see. Someone wanted to know if these worms were red wiggler worms.
No, this is actually an earthworm. And so there's 3 different kinds of worms, and the red wigglers, as you probably know, like to, they like to kind of stay at the surface there at the interface between the rotting vegetation and the soil. But earthworms, night crawlers, right? They go deep down into the soil and they make these big tunnels and they drag the leaf litter down. And I've actually been a big problem in some forests, like in the East Coast, where the wildflowers depend on leaf litter, and the earthworms absolutely just devastate the forest floor. And so we just welcome them though now there they are in our gardens and fields. We may as well appreciate them.
Thank you.
Okay.
Someone had a question on, I'm going to get there, this slide. What are these insects that are on the left?
Okay, so on the far left, those are lacewing eggs. And if you buy lacewings, you can get them as eggs, larvae, or adults. It doesn't matter. I've heard about a couple of small children's birthday parties where they release adult lacewings as part of the fun. And this one, the next one there, the white and black beetle, that is actually a type of lady beetle. And so if you think of lady beetles as being red with black spots, not always true. Some of them are black with a couple red spots. Some of them are like this. Some of them are tiny, tiny, tiny little things the size of a pinhead. So that's why I say you can plant these gardens to attract all these species. If you want to buy ladybugs, which are Coccinellidae family, then you're very limited in which ones you can buy. You can buy a mealybug destroyer, Rincon vitova, which sells insects. I know they have mealybug destroyer, and they have the migratory convergent lady beetle, which would be better to just attract to your garden. Plant pollen and nectar that lasts as long of a season as you can. In Santa Barbara, that means year round, basically. And just know that insects are seasonal too. So some of them only appear for a short period of time. Then this here, that's a lacewing larva. Next, that's that ugly looking sluggy thing. A lot of our best beneficial insects do their work in their larval stage, and they're not cute. So you might want to leave them alone. And then there's a ladybug larva of one species of lady beetle.
Wow, thank you. Peter wants to know, do you believe that insects in general are declining, as reported by the very extensive trapping studies done in Germany? Do you agree that the widespread use of neonicotinoids is devastating our insect populations?
Yes, I'm just running over here for 1 second to get something.
Sure.
Okay. So absolutely, yes. I know a number of scientists actually who have done talks on this subject. And this is the book that I have been reading lately, actually, and it's called Silent Earth, Averting the Insect Apocalypse. It was written by a professor named Dave Goulson. It's very readable. He is a bumblebee expert. I don't know which university he's at now, but it is in England. So professor of biology at the University of Sussex in Great Britain. And so, yes. And I'm going to say, as a person who is of a certain age, that when I was a little girl growing up in the Central Valley, if we went on a drive in the summertime, we had to wash the grill on the car and the windshield when we got home because it was completely splattered with insects. And that doesn't happen anymore.
Wow.
So, yeah, so it's a good book.
Thank you. One of our participants wants to know, what is the term for an insect that sings or makes noise? Is there a specific term?
Well, some they make noise in different ways. So some of them stridulate, it's called, they're rubbing like little wings together or a leg on a wing. I don't know if there is a term that is I just call them the musicians.
What was the term you just used for the rubbing that they do?
Stridulate.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, science is wonderful. It's full of terminology.
Yes, it is. Elaine Gibson, our beloved Elaine Gibson.
Oh, hi, Elaine. I love Elaine.
We love to see her. Said that the Shaw's agave that is at the Botanic Gardens in one of your last slides with the kids bloomed this fall.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
So, I'm looking forward to coming and visiting sometime in the coming year.
Yeah, that would be lovely.
Yeah.
Let's see, do we have any last questions?
I'm pretty easy to find, by the way, especially on Facebook. You can look up Garden Allies and you can find me, and I usually respond to messages, questions and messages pretty quickly.
Well, thank you so much for lending us your time this evening and your expertise and introducing us to hopefully one of our new favorite reads.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us this evening. And again, we hope to see you next month when we learn all about how phytoplankton are indicators of change in our Santa Barbara channel. Everyone have a great night and thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.